All right, guys, bang, bang. I've got Bo here. Super excited to do this. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Let's jump right into your background. What did you do before privacy.com?
Yeah. So I started my career as an engineer at a company called IAC, which is basically a tech private equity-esque holding company. They own Match.com, or used to own Match.com, used to own Expedia, still own Vimeo, a bunch of other internet properties. I was within the incubation group there called Hatch. We basically incubated 5 to 10 different companies. Pretty much all of them died except for one, which was Tinder. And so that was sort of my first exposure to tech and what venture-backed returns and portfolio theory looks like. Afterwards, I decided to do my own thing. This is around 2012, 2013. There's this really interesting thing called Bitcoin at the time, and kind of got interested into digital currency. And came up with our first idea, which is basically a Bitcoin-backed debit card. So there are a ton of those now. Coinbase just launched one. But at the time, it's a pretty novel idea. And the thinking was like, people have Bitcoin, and it's actually kind of hard to spend your Bitcoin. So why not, bring sort of the convenience of the card network rails to Bitcoin. We talked to something around 50 banks at that time. And I'd say the responses from the banks kind of fell into 2 categories. You had banks that didn't know what Bitcoin was and naturally somewhat risk averse. So they were like, nah, this is not for us. Let's wait a few years. And then you had banks that were pretty forward looking and knew what Bitcoin was. And they were like, definitely no, the door is there. Get out. And so we, honestly kind of hit a roadblock there. And sort of refocused a little bit. And we're still really interested in, improving the financial infrastructure. And this is where the idea for privacy.com came out of, where we said hey, what are the valuable parts, of Bitcoin to a consumer as a spending instrument? So there are 2 things: the security, it's a push mechanism versus a pull mechanism, and then the second thing is sort of the privacy and the pseudonymity of it. And so we basically came up with the idea to generate virtual cards on the fly using a browser extension and a mobile app. And you can set spending controls on it. It's really great for managing subscriptions, sharing cards with friends, family, coworkers, so on, right? And so this was back in 2016-ish when we launched. And as we scaled the company, we realized that the issuing infrastructure that we built our product on top of wasn't really that stable. So we ended up actually having to build our own issuer processor. So quick sort of overview on payments. So you swipe a card, that card goes from the merchant acquirer to the to Visa or MasterCard, and then they pass it on to what's called an issuer processor that then decrypts and sort of accepts or declines a transaction. So we actually had to build that entire piece of infrastructure out. And over time realized that actually, hey, many other companies want what we've built for ourselves. So over the past year and a half or so, we've actually been opening up an API to allow developers to issue credit or debit cards essentially on the fly, programmatically. So
I love it. Let's go back to IAC. You guys are incubating Tinder. What did you learn going through that process? If you had to take away 1 or 2 learnings for people who are listening, what was the 1 or 2 things you learned?
Yeah, so 2 things that really kind of stuck out. First of all, people always say there's no such thing as an overnight success, and I saw that very much firsthand with Tinder. If you sort of looked at the press, it seemed team had an idea, they built it in a week, and boom, it was just wildfire, fastest growing app ever, on college campuses or whatever, right? Behind the scenes, it was a lot more sort of concerted, deliberate. It was kind of like pushing up a boulder up a hill, and then eventually getting enough energy, to, as things started rolling. So that was very valuable early career perspective, seeing that firsthand. The second thing, which is less obvious, which wasn't a direct takeaway from Tinder, was cap table management is super important early on, because with the incubation model, what ends up happening is a lot of the incubator basically ends up owning a lot of the company. And so if your product doesn't have product market fit really early on, it's very hard to capitalize a company. You eventually have to recap the company, to keep going. And I think there are a handful of companies, and really good ideas out of the incubator that maybe could have survived if the cap table was a little more equitable towards the team.
Yeah, that's awesome. And when you got into Bitcoin, when was the first time you heard about Bitcoin, or like what kind of pulled you down the rabbit hole?
Yeah, so I think I heard about Bitcoin in college, or maybe it was like briefly after. It was around that time, like 2011-ish time frame. And it seemed like kind of a toy at the time. I think everyone thinks, it kind of seemed like a toy at the time. People were, setting up their own mining rigs and stuff like that, which is like really cool. And it's like that's like super interesting from a technology perspective. What got me interested and kind of drew me to Bitcoin originally was actually I like many people had like pretty poor experiences with like PayPal as a company. I think if you were doing stuff on the internet in like the mid 2000s, like I was in high school, just had a pretty bad experience there, and saw it as kind of an opportunity to kind of do things differently. So that was the original kind of hook for me, where it's like bad experience, how can we make it better?
Yeah, absolutely. And then when people hear privacy.com, the first thing I think of is how the hell did you get that URL? What's that story?
Yeah. So that is a good question.
Every time there's a good URL, there's always a good story behind it.
There is always a good story. I think I encourage early stage companies to try to punch above their weight on domain, because it just lends you a bunch of credibility, especially if you're doing something that requires like high trust or in financial services space. How we ended up coming up with it was we actually contacted the owner of the domain, and he wasn't doing anything with it at the time. And we said, hey, we're working on this, cool new product, and basically pitched the owner on what we were doing. He was excited about it and basically invested the domain in the company. And we had a clause that basically said, hey, like if we go belly up or whatever, like you can get the domain back. So, it's a pretty low risk, investment in that sense, especially if you're not doing anything with the domain for like 10 years.
Absolutely. So basically it was like, hey, you give us the domain. If this works, you'll get some equity. If it doesn't work, then we'll give it back to you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is also around the time where when Uber is really taking off, and Uber famously got like 2%, traded like 2% of the company for the domain. And that was like a phenomenal investment. So that was a great case to kind of point to for us.
Absolutely. Well, now you just got to go build the next Uber and make them very, very happy, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Let's talk about these secure virtual cards. So walk us through the process. I'm going to buy something on the internet. How do I interact with the product?
Yeah. So you sign up, you connect a funding source. Generally sign up takes 3 minutes. You put in some personal information so that we can comply with the law effectively and run our KYC processes. And then you install either our browser extension or mobile app. And then anytime you go to a checkout page, there's a little button that shows up next to the checkout form. You click the button and you can generate a brand new card number on the fly. As you're creating the card, you can set limits on it. You can have it be a one-time use card. So if you're signing up for a subscription that you're not sure you want to renew, it's really good for that kind of use case, and sort of, smaller websites where you're maybe not sure about the security and so on.
Got it. And so when I'm going to do this, what's the risk to me, right? Like obviously there's a ton of benefits in terms of it provides much more security and privacy, but what are the risks associated?
The risks associated with signing up. Look, I think there's fundamentally there's a social contract being entered with us where if we get breached, that is a risk. So you're basically saying, hey, privacy.com, in exchange for trusting you with my information, you're going to make my life more secure, more convenient, and easier. So that's one. I think another trade-off, not necessarily a risk, is rewards points. So some folks are, rewards junkies, and you don't get credit card rewards with our product. So that's sort of a very clear downside.
Yeah. And it seems like kind of the initial use case here or the experience is very much I set up the card with the parameters, right? So I want a one-time use card. I want it to be able to spend up to $1,000. I then go to Nike.com and I say, hey, I'm going to buy $700 worth of this. And I basically protected my privacy and security by preemptively going and getting this one-time use card through your platform. It would make sense, I think, and it sounds like you're already trying to work on this, where I just go to Nike.com, and when I go to checkout, Nike.com basically automatically does this for me kind of in the background so that my my credit card details or my banking information is never exposed throughout that transaction. Is that a world where you think like, the pie in the sky vision is like every single website in the internet will have some version of that experience at some point in the future? Or is that more dreams than reality and just we'll never get there?
I'm not sure. Yeah, so I'm not sure we'll actually ever get there. I think what you're seeing that is kind of interesting is there are more and more different options at checkout now that do involve like single-use cards. So, for example, if you go to Peloton and you decide to do a buy now pay later loan, or maybe Peloton's maybe not a good example, but like you can go to other websites and get a sort of point of sale financing. And sometimes like that's dispersed via a card that's generated on the fly. And it's actually not only are you getting financing for the product, it's also more secure because, it's not, you're not entering in your actual card information.
Yeah. And how does this change for the merchant? Do they care, or is there any pros or cons versus whether I'm using my card or using kind of the one-time use or some sort of privacy.com virtual card?
So what we find is like for bigger merchants, the main thing is actually like it does help from a convenience perspective. You click the button and like you just go. And so that's the main benefit for a merchant, larger merchant. For smaller merchants, we actually find the peace of mind really helps a lot more. So if you're going to Amazon or like Walmart or whatever, like maybe you're not that worried about like what's happening with your card info. If you're going to like a much smaller merchant, that does become something that comes up in people's mind where it's like, oh, there's a little apprehension. Like maybe I shouldn't be buying this product from this website. Maybe I should be going to Amazon or somewhere else to see if there's a similar product, right? So we find that like it does actually help with conversion rate. It's just like it's sort of different levers depending on who the merchant is.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. If you can make your customers believe, hey, we are trustworthy, and some, whether it's through the URL that you have, right, or through the use of virtual cards, things like that, conversion would go up. Talk to me about this API or set of APIs that you guys are building. It seems like that's kind of stage 2 for you guys in this business, is using those APIs to really try to scale and become much more of a like integral part of the infrastructure of companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think there's a kind of similar analog of Amazon and AWS where we built all of this infrastructure because if you look at like, just in terms of like payment volume, we're on track in the US to do $10 trillion in, credit, debit, prepaid card volume by 2023. And 95+% of that is going to run over like basically at that point, 40-year-old companies like FleetCor, TSYS, Jack Henry, so on, right? They do a great job, but like, fundamentally, it's very old infrastructure that makes it relatively hard to innovate and build new products on top of, actual sort of card issuance. And so we ended up actually in the process of building our virtual card product, had to build all the pieces around issuing credit or debit cards, or largely debit cards, but we can also support credit cards. And finding like tons of other companies want to do this as well. It's normally a really painful process. So let's say you wanted to, issue a card. Today, it's actually usually a 12 to 18 month process, and costs on the order of $500K to $1 million in terms of expenses. And that's like legal, payroll, setup fees with the various stakeholders and gatekeepers. So we're sort of looking to dramatically bring down the cost of like issuing a card with our APIs.
Got it. And so what's kind of the vision there, right? Let's fast forward 10 years. Like you were able to build out the technology from the API suite. How are you positioned kind of in the market with all these other players?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful in some ways to frame this in the context of the acquiring world, because card acquiring is a much better understood space. If you look at companies like Stripe, Adyen, Braintree, and so on, they've done a really good job on the acquiring side to make it really dead simple for any developer to accept cards online. The issuer processing space, which is the other side of a financial transaction in the card world, lags this by around 7 to 10 years. So what they've done, the Adyens and Stripes of the world, in making acquiring processing super product and developer oriented, we're looking to do for the issuing processing world.
Got it. And so what is the kind of concerns or the way that this is treated with law enforcement, governments, et cetera, right? So the first second that somebody says, hey, I want to hide my identity, it feels like all of the people in suits and ties with badges say like, oh, you're hiding something, right? Usually that ends up not being true, but that's definitely the reaction. And so one, have you guys seen people saying like, why do you need to use the virtual cards? Have you seen kind of nefarious activity, or just how do you think about preventing that, anything in that space?
Yeah. So, I mean, as a financial services company, we obviously take compliance, regulation, and that all that very seriously. And in order to operate in the U.S., we need to. And so that is an integral part of kind of what we built. That is. So that's one piece of it. We need to have a compliant, KYC and AML and BSA policy as a company, and as do all other card issuing companies. On the other hand, I do think sort of the definition of privacy and how important that is changing as everything is going digital. So if you think about it, we're in a world today where, not to sort of get super tinfoil hatty, but everything, the cost of storage and the cost of computing are both effectively going towards zero. And what that means is basically, everything that you do online can be tracked and can be searched pretty quickly. And so I think that is kind of a paradigm shift that it has come. And maybe the full effect of it hasn't been felt. Whereas previously, if you go to a local bodega or somewhere and you hey, I want to buy something in cash, that's pretty, that's totally legal. Maybe you're buying a pack of gum or, a bag of Cheetos or whatever, you're buying something totally legal, but it's also private. And that's a right that's kind of being eroded, I think, in today's world.
Yeah. And it also feels like the only way to fight back against this is going to be with technology, right? Like there's not going to be some, hey, let's go negotiate in the halls of Congress or something. It definitely feels like the non-technology momentum is against those who believe in privacy, individual freedom, et cetera. And the last remaining kind of, parachute, lifeboat, whatever, is to build the technology just to make this standard across these various technology companies, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I'm super bullish on the space. I think if you look at investors, I think investors are starting to come around it, but I think for a really long time, there's actually this received wisdom, around this around the privacy and security space, where all the tools out there were super user and friendly and accessible, and as a result, no one wanted to invest in the space to build more user friendly and accessible tools, because there's a perception that, hey, the only people that use these really crappy tools are criminals or people that are super paranoid. And it's not a fair one-to-one comparison if you're comparing Uber and Tinder and Gmail to super underfunded academic products that of course your average consumer doesn't want to use, right?
Absolutely. Talk a little bit about your partnership with 1Password and kind of what that is going to look like.
Yeah. So, shortly after we announced our API, we started talking with 1Password. As a company, we're sort of I think there's a lot of sort of overlap in terms of where we'd like to see the world. 1Password, what they're doing with passwords, there's a perfect analog to what we're doing with cards. And originally we started talking about maybe a co-marketing type thing, or some way to sort of join forces to get the word out more to more folks. But over time, it was like, oh, this is actually something that we should just integrate and allow folks to generate virtual cards from 1Password. And so that sort of integration actually came together really quickly because we already had an API, and they were sort of able to very quickly ingest and integrate that API. So
absolutely. Yeah. And in terms of continuing that, is that something where you'll look for other partners to have similar types of partnerships and can kind of grow somewhat organically by just kind of getting this through other distribution pipes through those partnerships?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of like what we want to do as a company, we want to make payments safer and easier for everyone. And that isn't necessarily like being, the go-to first party app that's, on, the bottom of your iPhone or whatever is not really necessarily the way, we're dogmatic about doing it. So, partnering with like-minded companies and getting sort of distribution and even, a white label approach is something that, we're very, very much pursuing.
Absolutely. What's the biggest challenge for you guys right now?
The challenge. From a company perspective, I think honestly, the hardest thing has been adjusting to like a fully remote setup. I think this gets glossed over sometimes, but people often get a lot of social interaction from their work, and I think being remote and staring at a computer screen for 8 hours a day is like not really the same as like the in-office human interaction. So that's something that we're still very much kind of adjusting to. And there's also stuff around communication, like how do you make sure that everyone's on the same page as you're growing in a remote world. So I think like many companies, we're sort of navigating that.
Absolutely. Before we get into the rapid fire to wrap this up, what would just your pitch be to users, right? So there's a bunch of people who are listening to this. You've got the floor. What is your pitch on why they should use privacy.com for virtual cards?
Yeah, so the reason why you should use this for virtual cards is we make your life safer and more convenient. So we save you time and money. That's what it comes down to. Everyone's had the experience of like, hey, I signed up for Boing Wi-Fi 6 months ago, and I'm just finding out that they've been charging me $14 a month or whatever it is for the past couple months. And so, not only do we, save you time in making that purchase a lot faster, we also save you money in terms of like, forgetting to cancel transactions and so on.
That's a pretty good pitch, saying that you're going to save someone time and money. That tends to be something that people are very interested in.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, I always ask everyone the same 2 questions, and then you'll get to ask me 1 question at the end. The first question is, what is the most important book that you've ever read?
It's a good question. I am a listener of the podcast, so I'm going to buck the trend a little bit. I think a lot of folks say like an early book that they read, and there's a book that I read recently called Out of the Gobi. It's by this Chinese private equity fund manager, and I think it's now like a $40 billion fund. And what's interesting about it is he grew up during the Cultural Revolution and basically spent 6 years of his life, instead of going to high school and college, doing hard manual labor out in the Gobi Desert. He came to the US, ended up getting his PhD, and now sort of is obviously super successful. Interesting for really 3 reasons. The first being that obviously it's super, super inspirational. I think in a world where youth is like kind of prioritized and like everyone's like, oh, like if you haven't made it by 25 or 30, you're kind of a failure, right? I think it's really inspiring to sort of hear about this person that basically lost 6 years of their youth. And is still like, been really successful. The second one on a personal note that is really resonated with me is, my parents came here as graduate students. And I think this is a piece of Chinese history that doesn't really get talked about very much. And so it's this like whole generation that kind of went through this. And it's like a really sort of unvarnished perspective on that. I feel like there's a third. Now I'm blanking on it. Let's come back. I'm sure I'll think of the third thing.
That's a great suggestion, though. I love books where you can, one, learn about something, two, there's like the inspiration, and then three, also like there's a personal connection to the book for you, right? Like I always, after asking so many people this question, it's like very much what did the book mean to them, more so than like this specific book is the most important book in the world. Right. And it's always interesting. Usually it is time related, right? So like you said, earlier in your life, there's some formative period, they read some book. But this one sounds pretty cool. So I'll have to check it out for sure. Second question, aliens. Are you a believer or a non-believer?
I'm a believer. The world is way too big for us to be, is it, a carbon life form? Is, are aliens, do aliens, walk and talk like us? Like, probably not, right? But like alien life forms, like I would say like definitely do exist. So
let me ask this question. I've never asked anyone this before, but just came to me. Do you think it's more likely that, quote unquote, some carbon life form, intelligent life, whatever you want to call it, is on like the moon / Mars? Or do you think it's something where it's so far away that like, it'll be your grandkids who even have a chance to potentially figure it out?
That is interesting. That's a good question.
And I don't know the answer, obviously, right? But it's like, is it something where it's closer to us, or it actually is really, really far away?
Yeah. I guess I would say I'm actually long on both. So
explain that.
So I think there's feels like a reasonable likelihood that there's like some, if life came from like a, asteroid or something like that, that it's also like somewhere else in the ecosystem, in the solar system. But I also think that it's very likely, given how, big the universe is, that there's life elsewhere too. So almost certainly there's life elsewhere, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was life, elsewhere in the solar system. But
yeah, it's just fascinating to me to think about if it was both, right? Like what, and again, there's no data that suggests this now, but like what if every planet had some form of intelligent life on it? People's entire concept of space would change.
It'd be mind blowing.
Right. All right. What question do you have for me to wrap this up?
Let's see. What is have you picked up any sort of post-COVID or like, during COVID, like New York specific habits? Like, has there been anything there that's like really been like, hey, like I really like this about like New York City?
Yeah, I was gonna say from like a habit standpoint, there's a couple of things. So like one, I now every single day go on a walk. During like the hardcore like lockdown component of COVID, it was more of like I gotta get out of my apartment. I can't sit here all day type thing. Now it's more of like I enjoy it. Plynn and I go and kind of walk around. So that's nice. The second thing is I've like really focused on sleeping more. I don't think that like I had anything that was preventing me from doing it before. It just like wasn't a priority. Right. And like, maybe I traveled a lot and that kind of screwed it up a little bit, but like, that's been really nice to kind of like say, hey, I'm going to sleep at least 8 hours every single night. And when you prioritize things, obviously, you end up doing it. And then the only other thing I would say is just, there's little things in New York that you or I probably took for granted before. And so it's less about like some new habit as much as it's like, man, I really enjoyed doing X. Right. And so, like a kind of a easy one is, I don't know if you've ever been to the JP Morgan Library
I have.
in New York. Right. So like one of my favorite places in New York. And the other day I was talking to Plynn and I was just like, man, I kind of want to go, but like it wasn't open. Right. And so you're just like that is so stupid. But yet at the same time, like you start to realize just how important that type of stuff is. So I think that's probably like the things that I've quote unquote picked up. What about yourself? Anything that you specifically like feel like you picked up?
Yeah. It's really funny. As you said, like going for walks and sleeping more. Those are two things that like I've like very much started doing. And I actually I got this Aura kind of a I guess plug uh, during COVID, and it's been like actually really helpful. It's
Really?
like my favorite fitness tracker, I guess, that I've used in terms of like just being able to kind of keep uh, keep using it.
Yeah.
Those are two that definitely resonate. I think another thing that I've really enjoyed is just outdoor dining. It's one of these things where like I kind of hope stays in some capacity. So yeah.
My brother jokes. We were talking about it before. They built these like huge buildings in the street, and he's like, they're not taking those down.
Yeah.
like those business owners just expanded their square footage. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, totally. I think like, but everyone I talk to likes it. The businesses obviously like it. So I feel like those are probably going to stay. We'll just, we'll see though. Yeah.
Absolutely. They just got to figure out how to keep them warm during the winter, right?
Yeah.
So we'll see. All right, Bo, listen, where can people find you on the internet or find more about privacy.com?
Yeah, for sure. So privacy.com, go to the website, privacy.com. I'm keep a pretty low profile online, but occasionally tweet at BowlingJ. It's BOLINGJ. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this. Everyone go check it out. Virtual cards, in my opinion, are a no-brainer. I mean, if you want to basically keep your privacy and security, you should probably use a virtual card rather than the credit card in your wallet or purse. Go check it out. But we'll have to do this again in the future, my friend. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.